as we seek your word in the Gospels tonight, we ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and redeemer. Amen. So, of course, in June we're looking at the Gospels, and so far we've looked at Matthew and we've looked at Thomas, and this week we're looking at Mark. So, Mark, of course, there's lots of ideas, just like the rest of the Bible, about who wrote it, and when it was written, and why it was written, and who the target audience was. And if I went through them all, we'd be here all night, and you'd be just as confused as I was. So what I'm going to do is just give you what I think is the most likely account. Not because there's more evidence to support it than any others, but because I like it better than the others. So if you want to go deeper, then have a look online. There is oodles and oodles of resources. I mean, after all, we've been looking at these books for 2,000 years. You can imagine the stuff that's been written about them. So if you want to have a bit deeper look, then have a look online. But of course, the first question is, was it actually written by Mark, by John Mark? And actually, I think so, because he's first mentioned in Acts chapter 12, where his mother has a house in Jerusalem where some of the early church met. And I don't know which Mary, it doesn't specify which Mary, but you'll remember there were a few. But Mark was important enough to get a mention. And it's here also that we see the first link with the Apostle Peter. Now, do you remember in the story in Acts when the Apostle Peter's in prison, and suddenly there's lights everywhere, and the chains fall off, and Peter leaves, do you remember? And the house he goes to, remember, he knocks on the door, and a servant goes to the door, and instead of opening the door, goes back inside and says, "It's Peter at the door," and keeps him waiting for ages and ages. That's Mary's house. So that's Mark's mother's house, and that's in Jerusalem. So that's the first time that we see a link between Mark and the Apostle Peter. And then when the Apostle Paul and Barnabas go off on their first missionary trip, Mark goes with them. And they travel together for a while, but then we understand that something goes wrong, and Mark returns to Jerusalem on his own. And I think they must have had some kind of a row, because in Acts 15, when Paul and Barnabas are heading out to visit some of the churches that they set up on their first mission, Barnabas wants to take Mark with them, and Paul refuses, saying that since he bailed on them during the first trip, then he had no right to go with them on the second trip. And of course, what happened was Paul had to go off with Silas, because Barnabas was Mark's cousin. So Barnabas sided with Mark, and the two of them went off and did their own thing, and Paul went off with Silas. So you can imagine there was a bit of friction there, and there was some stuff going on. Now, we don't hear really much of anything else about Mark until Paul writes his letter to the congregation in Colossae. And at the end of his letter, he says that Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, he says, sends his love. Now, we know that Paul was in prison in Rome, so Mark must have been there too. In fact, in 2 Timothy, we see Paul asking for him, saying what a big help he is. So it's safe to assume that over the kind of 10 to 12 years difference between the first trip and Paul being in prison, that there must have been some kind of reconciliation, and they kind of worked things out. And to be honest, I like this version of events, because not only does it tally with Scripture, but you know, when you read Paul, he's such a hothead. He's always in trouble, and invariably you find him in the middle of a row. He never does things simply. He lives with his heart on his sleeve, and despite all the terrible things that he endures for the gospel, he's the most easily hurt when the people around him don't behave the way that he thinks they should behave. So he does forgive, we see that here with Mark, but it does take some time. You know, after the row in Corinth, do you remember the story about the row in Corinth? So in Corinth, Paul gets a letter saying that there's Apollos there, and Apollos has been preaching something, and Paul goes and has this showdown with Apollos and loses. Now there's a lot of ideas about who Apollos was. One of them is that he was a Greek rhetor, which means basically he was a Greek storyteller that went from place to place and had a version of the Christian story to tell. And because he was a professional storyteller, then of course he was an actor. He won because Paul wasn't a great speaker. And Paul went off and he was really, really upset. And he ends up going to Athens, where he stays with Priscilla and Aquila for a while. And when he's really upset, he writes to them at the beginning of 2 Corinthians 4. He says, I wrote to you out of great distress and anguish of heart, with many tears, not to grieve you, but to let you know the depth of my love for you. I mean, he really takes it personally. There's no kind of half measure with Paul. So anyway, it's safe to say that Mark is in Rome, at least visiting, and most probably Peter is in Rome too. Now, it doesn't say so in the Bible. We don't have that evidence. But all the evidence does point to Paul being martyred in Rome. And a lot of the church fathers talk about Peter being in Rome. So I think that Mark was in Rome, and when Mark was in Rome, Mark listened to Peter preach and tell the stories about Jesus. Now remember, at that point, there's lots of writings floating around with Jesus' teachings and parables on them. Remember last week we looked at the Gospel of Thomas, which was just sayings, just parables. So we do know that in the oral tradition at that point, there were various writings going around with the sayings of Jesus on. But there wasn't anything going around with Jesus' life story on. And who knew Jesus' life story better than Peter? So Peter's in Rome, and he's not just talking about what Jesus taught, but he's talking about Jesus' life. He's talking about the events. He's talking about the sequence of events. And I think that what happened was that Mark sat at his feet with a lot of other people and listened to these stories. And the churches in Rome, of course, there were quite a few Christians in Rome, would sit and listen to Peter preach. But then the unthinkable happened. And in 64, there was a great fire in Rome, and 2/3 of the city burnt to the ground. Now, although it's thought that Nero actually had the fire started so that he could build his great golden house, which was this, I don't know if you've ever seen his idea for a temple, but his idea for a temple to himself was 1/3 of Rome. I mean, basically, he wanted to flatten 1/3 of Rome to build this huge temple to Nero, to himself. And of course people wouldn't let him, the Senate wouldn't let him, so they think that what he did was he had Rome burned so that he could then facilitate this. But whether or not that's true, what we do know is that all of the minority groups, especially Christians, got blamed for it, and many were martyred. And at that point, Peter was killed. So who would tell Peter's stories? I mean, especially to the Gentiles who knew that Jesus was Jewish, but didn't even understand some of the Jewish customs that Jesus used. And I think it was then that Mark wrote his gospel. So you'll find that lots of people date Mark's gospel around 64, 65. So it's before Jerusalem was destroyed, which was in 70, and it's after Rome burnt, which was in 64. So I think there's other kind of pointers that help us to see that this is the case. He explains lots of Jewish customs, like I said, like hand washing, which of course anyone who is Jewish would understand. He talks about the day of preparation and says that that's the day before the Sabbath. And anyone who was Jewish would know this. So I think that what Paul's doing is he's trying to write for a Gentile audience. And the other thing that he does, which you wouldn't do if you were speaking to Jews in Jerusalem especially, is that he translates Aramaic. So he wrote, for example, they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull. Now, of course, if you were Jewish and you spoke Aramaic, you would know exactly what Golgotha meant. And then in 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Again, if you speak Aramaic, if you're local, then you'd know this. But of course, he's not writing for a local audience. He's not writing for a local Jewish audience. He's writing for a Gentile audience, which is why he then explains these things so that they have an idea of what's going on. So it's short. It's a lot shorter than Matthew or Luke or John. I mean, the whole gospel starts with John the Baptist. It doesn't even start with Jesus' birth. There's no family tree. There's nothing like that. I mean, right at the beginning, Jesus is baptized by John, and you have this heavenly voice that announces him as the Son of God. Then, if you go through the gospel, you find that he's tested in the wilderness by Satan. John is arrested, and Jesus begins to preach the good news of the kingdom of God. Next, Jesus gathers his disciples and begins his teachings. He drives out demons, he heals the sick and lepers, he raises the dead, he feeds the hungry, he gives sight to the blind, he delivers this long discourse in parables to the crowd. But actually, in general, he doesn't have much of Jesus' teaching in there. There isn't the parables that you have in Matthew or that you have in Luke, for example. I think you have maybe 11 in the Gospel of Mark, and you have like 27 in Luke. So it's not about Jesus' teachings, which makes me think that the people there knew what his teachings were. Rather, it's about his life. It's about how his teachings fit into his journey and his life story. So he then begins teaching. He drives out demons, he heals the sick, the lepers, he raises the dead, he feeds the hungry, he gives sight to the blind. He delivers this long discourse on parables to the crowd, which of course is supposed to be for the disciples. And when you read it, you get this feeling that he's actually speaking kind of through the crowd to the disciples. And the disciples don't understand what he's saying. Then he does some amazing things, like he calms the storm, he walks on water, and while God and the demons recognize him in the story, neither the crowds nor the disciples understand who he is. It's what's called the messianic secret. Nobody really knows who he is, which is another reason why I think perhaps it was a gospel written for the Gentiles, because they were like, hang on a minute, if this guy was the Son of God and he was Jewish, how come all the Jews don't know about him? So Mark's gospel has this secret that's threaded through it. And at one point, Jesus asks his disciples, he says, who do people say that I am? And they all give kind of various answers. And in the end, he says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter says that he is the Christ and that he is the chosen one. He is the Messiah. And at that point, Jesus tells him to be quiet. So I think that that's really telling, because the one person who understands him and knows who he is Peter. And whose story is this? It's Peter's story that Mark's been writing down. So of course it would make sense that the one person who understood it and who knew who Jesus really was would be Peter, because he's the background for the gospel. Then Jesus explains that the Son of Man's got to go to Jerusalem and be killed, but will rise again. And then we have Moses and Elijah appearing with Jesus, and God tells the disciples, this is my son, but they're all as thick as soup and none of them get it. They just don't understand who he is. Then of course Jesus goes to Jerusalem, where he's hailed as the one who comes in the name of the Lord, which of course we celebrate on Palm Sunday. Yeah. And then he's also hailed as the one who will inaugurate the kingdom of David, again tying everything in. Then he goes to the temple, he drives out those who are buying and selling animals, he debates with the Jewish authorities, he goes on the Mount of Olives and he announces the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the persecution of his followers, and the coming of the Son of Man, the heir of humanity in power and glory. And then we have a quiet bit where a woman perfumes Jesus' head with oil, do you remember? Pours the oil all over his head, and Jesus explains that this is a sign of his coming death. And then Jesus celebrates the Passover with the disciples, where he declares the bread and wine to be his body and blood. And from there, he goes to Gethsemane to pray, where Judas betrays him and he's arrested. So then he's interrogated by the high priest. He says that he's the Christ, the Son of God, and will return as Son of Man at God's right hand. The Jewish leaders turn him over to Pilate, who have him crucified as one who claims to be king of the Jews. Jesus, abandoned by all the disciples, is buried in a rock tomb by a friendly member of the Jewish council. The women who followed Jesus come to the tomb on Sunday morning. They find it empty, and they're told by a young man in a white robe to go and tell the others that Jesus has risen and gone before them into Galilee. But Mark says that they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's where it ends. It ends on this extraordinary cliffhanger. Now, in some Bibles, there's a few bits extra. But those bits we know weren't added until many years later because they weren't in the original Gospels. And they were probably added by people who thought, what kind of ending is this? Because it leaves you thinking, hang on, what happened next? So the women find that Jesus has been raised, and then they say nothing. What's next? And Mark uses these extraordinary phrases like, at once. This happened at once. And immediately Jesus went. And immediately this happened. And this may have been to convey a sense of urgency. I mean, with 2/3 of Rome in ashes, Christians being blamed, it must have felt like kind of very near the end. Or it may just have been his style. You know, in Aramaic, phrases like at once and immediately were kind of used to link stories. Like we would say, and then, or we would say, and then next, you know. So they were phrases that were often used in Aramaic. And they both kind of make sense. Then, if you're geeky like me, you might be interested to know that Mark's written in the style of a Greek tragedy, which kind of explains the ending, that cliffhanger. Luke and Acts have kind of similar styles, but Mark's is much more blatant. It's much more like a street play than a religious piece, probably because it's written for everyday people who would have been used to seeing street performers, and it was most likely at first a street performance. Now, if that sounds a bit strange, think of it in today's terms. Let's say you decide to tell somebody's story. Well, you might decide to tell it as a murder mystery, or as a biography, or as a thriller, or a romantic comedy, or even a horror. I mean, the story itself would be basically the same, but the way you tell it would differ enormously depending on the genre in which you chose to tell it. And it's the same with the Bible. The Bible is a library of books that's packed with lots of different literary genres, from poetry to children's stories, formal works to very casual letters, like the ones that Paul sent. Now, some people might say that knowing about the genre and about how passages were put together spoils our reading of them, but actually I would argue the opposite. I think God shows us how, through Jesus, God wants to interact with the world. In other words, it's through humanity, it's through our humanity that God interacts with the world. You know, the foundation or fulcrum point of our connection with God is Jesus. But if we are his body, then God works through us, and in fact through many different humans in the world. And it would make sense for God to speak to us in the language and culture and genre and setting that we understand. And that's exactly what we see in the Bible. Imagine if the whole Bible was written the way that God thinks. You know, we have difficulty understanding it when it's written for the way that we think. We'd have an impossible task on our hands. So Mark's Gospel is very, very human. It grabs us with kind of the emergence of John the Baptist at the River Jordan, and it ends with the empty tomb. And imagine how exciting it must have been to watch this as a play or to hear it for the very first time, especially if you already knew some of Jesus' parables and teachings, but not the story of his life. The other interesting thing about Mark is how central women are. They stand equal to men in the story. And in fact, it's often the women that are central. It's women that support Jesus. It's women that stay with Jesus. It's women that find the empty tomb. And I have to wonder whether Mark is linking Jesus with the wisdom of Sophia, the same way that John later on, for example, linked Jesus with the Logos, or the Word, right at the very beginning. It's perhaps for that very reason that it was placed second in the New Testament after Matthew, even though it was the first one being written. It has this certain naivety that speaks to the heart. And politically, it can be a little dangerous. So I can imagine them wanting to hide it behind Matthew's much more formal gospel. But whatever way you read it, I hope that it touches you, because even 2,000 years after Mark wrote it, it still has the power to touch the heart. Amen.
Amen.